So the title of the lecture that I was asked to give was called No Limit Tournament Strategies, but there are a number of amazing presenters talking about, what hands to raise under the gun and what hands to raise on the button and, whatever. So I thought something that a lot of people don't talk about is image. And image, as we all know, is something that's really important in the game of No Limit Hold'em. People perceive you a certain way, you perceive other people a certain way, and that guides a lot of the decisions that we make throughout playing the game. So the title of the lecture that I'm going to give is called An Image Game. So basically, image is very important no matter how skilled your opponents are. Even the least skilled opponents are noticing your image. So they might not articulate it the same way. A very advanced player might say something like, this is a loose passive player who has low aggression on all streets and the river especially, so if you get raised in the river, it's generally a very strong hand. They like to 3-bet pre-flop, but they don't really like to 4-bet, something like that. But a less skilled player is also noticing your image. They're looking at you and saying, okay, what hands are you showing down? They might say something like, well, I saw that person show down a Jack-9 from early position. And even, lesser skilled players are going to take note of something like that and be more likely to maybe call you down in different spots. And so there are ways that we can manipulate that. There are ways that we can use that to our advantage. And that's something that I want to talk about today. So successful poker players should be able to use image in a number of ways. Number one is they should be able to recognize the different player types and know how to combat each type of player. Number two is every player should have an understanding of their own image and make plays that capitalize on it. And that's something that is sort of the second level of it. Really understand how people perceive you and use, adjust things like how often you're betting, your bet sizing, things like that to really take advantage of your own image. And the last thing is something that's even more advanced, and that's how to craft your own image in a way that you want. So I'm well known for being a very aggressive player. Obviously, I've made a lot of crazy bluffs, and some have been on TV, and sometimes it looks really stupid. But sometimes it actually gets me paid off in really great ways. And so I'm conscious of constantly doing things that are crafting that aggressive image and capitalizing on that to get paid off in a lot of situations. Because if I were just like making crazy bluffs all the time, I obviously wouldn't really be able to do very well. There are, I guess, 4 main types of players. There's definitely like variations of each one, but the main ones that we're going to talk about are, there's the tight passive player. That's the person that doesn't really play a lot of hands, and when they do, they're often limping in. The loose passive player is someone who is playing a lot of hands, but once again, they're just limping in. They're not really raising them very much. And pre-flop, but after the flop, same thing. Like, you're going to see a loose passive player. They might show up with hands as bad as like, 10-6 suited playing in early position because it's suited and it's pretty. But all of a sudden, if they raise you on a flop, their range of hands that they could hold is going to be a lot stronger. So just because they have all the bad hands in their range doesn't mean they're going to raise you with them. And so that's the sort of loose passive player. Then we have the tag and the lag, and that stands for tight aggressive and loose aggressive. And we're going to talk a lot more about those because those are going to be the 2 types of images, 2 types of playing strategies that I recommend most. Here you see examples here: pre-flop tendencies, loose passive limps a lot, post-flop the lag tends to barrel more, and the passive player is more likely to check and call and sometimes trap you, but generally be very sort of easier to play against, I think. One thing we want to talk about is how quickly can you distinguish players. When you see someone playing and you see their tendencies, immediately you want to start to make some sort of generalization in your head. You see a few hands, you see a way someone plays a hand, you see them sort of betting a lot. You're going to say, okay, they're a very aggressive player, and maybe they're a loose aggressive player. So from the get-go, we use the information that we have available to us. But that doesn't mean that we get married to the read that we have. That's a big thing, a big problem, a big mistake that a lot of players make is that they see someone do something in the early levels, before the antes, they're playing a lot of hands, and then all of a sudden later on in level 7 or level 8, this person's really calmed down and stopped playing all of those trash hands, and now all of a sudden, someone makes a call down when, it should be pretty obvious this person has a very strong hand, just because they got married to the read that they had early on. So it's important that you're constantly adjusting. I mean, over the years, if you talk about playing online, I don't know how many of you played online, but then you have a database and you have 1 million hands on someone. Okay, now you have a really strong read. In live poker, of course, we don't have that we don't have that luxury. So we make reads quickly, but then we're also willing to adjust them quickly. So really pay attention to how the players are playing in, I like to talk about the last 10 hands, the last 100 hands, and the entire time you've been seeing them playing. And that's what's going to really dictate what kind of player they are. One of the main things that we have to do in poker is we always want to have a plan for the hand. So anytime we have a plan, anytime we have a hand, we think about how are we going to proceed on various different flops, turns, and rivers. And one of the really important considerations that we take into account is the image of your opponent. So for instance, a good example is we have king jack suited on the button and an opponent middle position raises. What do we do? Well, is she aggressive? Is she playing lots of hands? What's she likely to do post-flop? How should we 3-bet or should we just call? You know, if this person's really tight, you know, tight aggressive, well, she's more likely to have a premium hand, so I may just call on the button. Or if she has only like 30, 35 big blinds, I'm probably just going to fold my hand because there's not enough, you know, you don't have enough implied odds to hit something, and the chance that you're dominated by a very tight player's range, which is going to be mostly ace-jack, ace-queen, pocket pairs, the chance of being dominated is very high. So against that type of player, I may fold. But if you're up against a loose aggressive player, I'm more likely to call with it and try to make a good hand, or sometimes even 3-bet, especially if you're in position. You know, it's a good situation to re-raise to put the pressure on your opponent. Now, if it's a very loose aggressive player and they're making lots of 4-bets, now all of a sudden king jack suited isn't a great hand to do that with anymore, because now if they go all in on you for 35 big blinds, you're put in a really tough predicament because they could go all in with a really bad hand. So against a player like that, if I'm up against a very loose aggressive player, king jack suited on the button is a great hand to play, so I'm more likely to call that. And the hands I'm more likely to re-raise with are hands that I'm happy when they go all in, like ace queen plus, tens plus, so maybe like, or nines, tens, jacks, queens, kings, aces, ace queen, ace king, maybe even ace jack if they're very aggressive. The hands that I'm likely to 3-bet them as a bluff are hands that I don't really care with it if they go all in. So if I have a hand like 9-6 suited, it's not a very good hand. It's not good enough to call. It's good enough to keep them in line once in a while because they're raising too much. But if they go all in, I don't really care. It's just a 9-6 suited. Also, how does our own image play into that decision? Well, once again, if I have that king jack suited, if I'm against a loose aggressive player, me personally, I don't really want to 3-bet that hand very much because I'm scared they're going to go all in with a very bad hand because I have a very loose image and they think that I'm 3-betting them light and they're going to shove with 6-5 suited or something like that. But if you're a tighter player, it's a good chance to re-raise and maybe take down the blinds and antes because it's something that they're not going to expect you to have a weak hand, and so they're often just going to fold, or sometimes they'll call and then you can bet, you know, when the flop comes you can bet and then they'll fold after the flop, and that's a good way to pick up chips. That's something we're going to talk about later, actually, is being a tight aggressive player and using re-raising to your advantage. It's something that you don't want to do too often because then you lose your tight aggressive image, obviously, but used in the right spots and at the right times, you can really capitalize on it in some really profitable spots. Another thing about having a plan for the hand, so an example is the flop. So I call on the button, let's say, and the flop comes queen, jack, 5, 2 hearts. You know, you have second pair with second kicker, which is, you know, a pretty strong hand, but obviously maybe if you're 50 big blinds deep, you don't want to play for your whole stack. So you think about, what am I going to do? Am I going to call on the flop if they make a continuation bet, let's say? Am I going to call? Am I going to raise? You know, what goes into those decisions? Well, are they likely to barrel? You know, are they likely to keep firing? What have you seen them do? Have you seen them bet the flop and then shut down? There are a lot of players, by the way, there are different types of aggressive players. Some aggressive players, you know, bet once, they'll raise a lot pre-flop, then they'll bet once, and then they'll never fire a second bullet unless they have it. That's something that's really important to keep track of because that type of player we can call once, and then we can probably fold if they continue to be aggressive. But a lot of players, if we call once, we're going to have to call at least twice and maybe sometimes 3 times, depending on how the board comes out and things like that. Another thing another example that I want to talk about is something, ways to combat like a loose aggressive player. I see a lot of players do this against me, and that's, you know, a lot of these examples come with ways to play aggressive players because I'm used to people playing me and I see the mistakes that they make. So let's say I raise in middle position and a player in the big blind is going to defend their big blind with ace-jack, which is definitely more than reasonable. Probably the best play just to call with ace-jack. And the flop comes out 8-6-3 rainbow. That flop is often likely to miss us both. If I have a hand like king 10 or king queen or, who even knows what I'm raising with Jack 5 suited? You know, it could be anything. You know, Ace Jack rates to be the best hand. So a lot of players will check call. You know, they'll check and then I'll bet and they'll call. And then the turn's a queen and they check and I bet again. And now they have Ace Jack and they're like, oh man, well now there's a queen out there, there's an 8, I could have anything, and then they fold. And to me, that's just something that's throwing away chips. And that's something where you really have to have a plan for the hand and realize what situation are you going to put yourself in. With the Ace Jack, while it rates to be the best hand at this time, it's likely that you're not going to improve. It's likely that the board's going to get uglier. You're out of position. I'm probably going to keep firing because that's how I play. So that's not really the best situation. Now, what can you do with Ace Jack on an 8-6-3? It's sort of rolling over if you just check and give up. Well, sometimes you check and give up. Sometimes maybe you even check raise. Although I'm likely, you know, once again, a loose aggressive player is used to getting check raised in that spot, so you might have to be prepared to fire multiple bullets. But I think a smarter approach, I mean, sometimes check raise, but a smarter approach in general would be just not worry about that hand and fold that hand, but instead, especially if you have a tighter image, slow play some of your bigger hands. So when you have Ace Jack, next time when you have pocket queens in that situation, instead of re-raising me, where I'm like, oh, warning bells are going off because a tight player is re-raising me, think about just calling. You know, it leaves yourself in a more vulnerable position, but it creates a really great situation for yourself against an aggressive player because when that 8-6-3 board comes down, or whatever it is, you check and I bet and you call, and you know the turn's a jack and you check, and you still have an overpair. And now what you're doing is not only are you allowing me to bluff as an aggressive player, but you're also allowing me to value bet very thinly, which is something we'll talk about later that loose aggressive players should be capable of doing. So once again, if I have, like, let's say I have King Jack in that spot, it comes 8-6-3, you check, I'm going to make my continuation bet, and you're going to call with your queens. Now the turn's a jack, you check again. I have no reason to think that I don't have the best hand. So with King Jack, I'm going to keep betting for value, and I'm probably going to bet pretty big because I'm making big bluffs, so I'm making big value bets. So you see with the queens, what you've done is you've sort of, it's a way of trapping that, you know, you don't want to raise, you don't want to overplay your hand because, you know, you really want to keep my range of hands wide. And what that means is you want to keep me bluffing, and you also want to keep me value betting worse hands. And that way you can be really confident that you're getting a lot of value. So that's sort of the way, like one really good way to, I guess, trap a loose aggressive player out of position. But the main thing that I wanted to get across is like having a plan for the hand. With the Ace Jack, it's not so bad to check call, especially against that player that bets one time and shuts down. But if you're against that player that doesn't really tend to do that, you have to think of an alternative approach, given the fact that the board's going to develop in a pretty ugly way, usually. I advocate 2 strategies, loose aggressive and tight aggressive. Like I said, I really don't think that you should be limping in very many hands. There are some situations where you can limp in, you know, small pairs in early position at a passive table. But even you know, with small pairs in early position, oftentimes at an aggressive table, I just fold them because the pot's going to be raised. If I hit my set, I'm not going to get paid off enough because most of the time I'm going to have to just fold on the flop, and the person's not going to have a good hand. So most of the time, you should be raising, or almost always. And loose aggressive is just playing more hands. Tight aggressive is sort of playing tighter, which is better. I don't think that there is really a better approach. I think it really depends on your own strengths. So I play lag because I'm a very good post-flop hand reader. I know when to apply the pressure. I think a lot of the more experienced cash game players that are used to playing deeper stacked are more successful loose aggressive players because they have played a lot more turns and rivers in their life, and so they, you know, can proceed with nothing in a smart way. Tag is great if you are patient, if you can cultivate that patient image, but also know when to capitalize on your spots. I think tag is probably the winning strategy for most players, for most, you know, beginning, intermediate, and even advanced tournament players. I think tag is probably going to be the most common winning strategy. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to craft your own image and capitalize on it. For a tag style, so once again, we want to play a certain strategy because it's profitable, but we also want to cultivate this image to make sure that people know that this is what we are, so that later on we can use that image and make really profitable plays that go against that image. So if we're a tag player, we're going to be folding a lot of hands, especially in early position, because position is incredibly important. So if you're a tag player, I want you folding ace-10 early position, ace-jack under the gun, just fold it. Start to raise ace-jack in middle position, ace-10 only from late position, things like that. Really play a positional game and just be folding a lot of hands that you think, because those hands get you in trouble anyway, and you know, it's probably a good strategy to be more cautious out of position anyway. When you do play a hand, though, your range of hands is much stronger. And so you're going to be barreling more. And what does that mean? What does barreling mean? That means you raise ace-jack in middle position, ace-queen. The board comes 8-6-3. You bet, and that person calls you, and the turn's like a 2. Okay? There's no reason to give up here. You likely don't have the best hand. You know, oftentimes that person has a pair. By the way, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just floating you. That means calling with nothing to take it away later. So sometimes that person doesn't even have a pair. But it doesn't even matter, because the point is whether or not that person has pocket nines or that person has king queen and they were just looking to take it away, they're probably going to fold on the turn regardless, because when you're a tag, when you're very tight, you're likely to have a stronger range of hands. So, I mean, this is when you're playing good players. I'm talking about they're likely to fold, because if I'm playing a tag and they're only raising 15% of hands, what's their range that they're raising? Ace-jack, ace-queen, ace-king, you know, nines, tens, jacks, queens, kings, king-queen suited, stuff like that. So they make a continuation bet, and I call. Then they bet again. Most tags, what they're doing is they're shutting down after they're called. And you probably all recognize this spot. It's scary when someone calls you on an 8-6-3 rainbow board. They could have a set. They could have an overpair. They could have lots of things. Well, the good player is going to know that most of the time tags are shutting down. So if you're a tag and you keep on betting, the great thing is, you know, your range is already so strong. There's already so many good hands in there that the person with even with pocket nines has to be really worried. Another example is, you know, the board is 10-7-2 and you bet, and they call, and it turns a 6. Well, what are they calling you with on the flop? They're calling you with ace-7, 8-7, maybe even pocket fives, you know, maybe ace-queen, stuff like that. The turn's a 6. Not only are they going to fold all the bad stuff in their hands, like the 7-8s and the ace-7s and the king-queens and all that stuff, but sometimes they're even going to fold hands as strong as jack-10 or queen-10, just because when you play tight, you have so many strong hands in your range that they're scared when you keep on betting. So, of course, you don't want to keep doing this every single time, but sometimes it's really good to barrel more. A great example of when it's the best thing to barrel more is after you re-raise pre-flop, if you're a tag. Because when you re-raise pre-flop and you're a tag, your range is really strong. You know, you're re-raising ace-king, aces, kings, queens, let's say, right? Like you know, maybe you're out of position. You re-raise the cutoff opens and the button calls, and you re-raise the big blind, and then you get called in one spot. And the flop is like 6-4-2, and you have ace-king. And you bet, and they call. And now you're like, oh, man, they have a pair. But guess what? If your range is aces, kings, queens, and ace-king, like, you happen to have the bad hand, but you have 3 other really good hands that they're going to be very scared of. And the biggest mistake I see really tight players make is checking after this spot, after they're called one time. Because, you know, honestly, like most of the time, people are going to fold to 2 barrels there. So that's something, once again, a way to capitalize on a tight image. Another thing, in the same way that barreling 2 times is likely to get you a lot of folds on the turns, one thing that, something called the pot control line, which basically means, so let's go back to their situation. You raise pocket jacks, okay, so someone raises, or you have pocket queens. Someone raises in early position, you re-raise them with pocket queens, okay, and they call. And the flop comes 9-7-3 rainbow. And they check, and you bet, and they call. We likely have the best hand, okay? We're not really that worried, but it's possible they have a set. If we have a lot of chips behind us, let's say the turn's a 5. They check. Sometimes it's really good to actually check behind here. Not necessarily because we're scared that we have the worst hand, but there's a number of reasons. Number one is, sometimes they have a better hand, and it saves us a lot of chips, because if we check behind and they bet the river, then we can just call, and then when they have a set, we actually don't lose as many chips in the tournament. Number two is, because we have this tight image, if we don't have the best hand, that's the only way that they're probably going to keep putting in chips. Like, when we have the best hand, they're often going to fold. If they have like a 10-9 suited, it comes 9-7-3, the turn's a 5, and we keep betting. Well, let's go back to what I just talked about. Your range is very strong, and they know that, so they're often going to fold a hand as strong as 9-10 to you on the turn. So what this means is you're unlikely to get 3 streets of value. Even if they call on the turn, the river's a 2 and they check, you bet, they're going to fold their 9-10 by the river most of the time. So you're not going to get 3 streets of value. So I advocate, I think, a pot control line on the turn is something that tags can do with those strong hands. Not the very strong ones. You know, if you have like a set of 9s, you want to keep betting just in case they happen to have something really good and they want to check raise you or whatever. You don't really want to check behind with a very strong hand just in case they have a lower set or they have 2 pairs, something like that. But if you have a hand like pocket queens, which is vulnerable to 2 pairs, you might want to check behind, get more value on the river. Also, sometimes when maybe they had a hand like Jack 10 and they were just floating you on the flop, 9, 7, 3, and then you check behind on the turn, and now they have Jack 10, but they think you have a hand like Ace King. So they're going to bet into you on the river, and you actually pick up a lot more chips from them that way too. So those are some really good things that tags can do. Barrel more when you're 3-betting, and take more pot control lines on turns when the board develops in a way that it's unlikely you're going to get 3 streets of value anyway. Okay, 2 more things real quick. Flat call, we talked about this earlier, flat call more hands, big hands, like we talked about with the queens out of position. In position is a great thing too, especially if you have a very tight image. Sometimes you want to be re-raising, especially against a looser player, but sometimes it's okay to just call because you're going to trap the players like we talked about, and if you're really tight, sometimes re-raising sends off warning bells. Now you might say to me, well, isn't that really risky, flat calling, because they could hit something really good? Of course it's risky, but we don't get anywhere in tournaments without taking risks, You can't always be worried about your tournament life. You want to be worried about putting yourself in the best situation to maximize your value, putting yourself in the best situation to win the tournament. And the best way to get chips, sometimes, not all the time, once again, a mixed strategy, but sometimes mixing it up by flat calling queens, kings, and aces to a loose aggressive player is going to be a really great way to get chips. Last thing, when you have a stack like 20, 21, 22 big blinds, something that tight aggressive players don't do very much, once again, they're worried about their tournament life, but I'm telling you, this is insanely profitable, is wait for a great steal spot and take it, okay? The loose player opens under the gun +1, 3 people call, or maybe 2 people call. So, the loose player opens 2.5 big blinds, you get a call and a call. Between the blinds and the antes, there's already 9 big blinds in the pot. You have 22 big blinds, and you're in the big blind, okay? Stick it in, it doesn't even matter. We're going to look at the math behind this real quick. I don't know if you guys can really see this, but this is a poker stove analysis. We're going to talk about, we have 6, 7 suited, okay? You might say, wow, but what if they have a hand? First of all, what if the loose player even has a hand like Ace 10 or Ace Jack? Well, first of all, the loose player that opened initially is likely not to have a hand as strong as Ace Jack or Ace 10. And even if they do, the crazy thing is, if you have a tight image, they're still not calling. So they're opening a range. I gave them a 26% opening range, which is about the range of a looser player, not a crazy one, but a loose aggressive player. The range is like all the suited stuff, like the suited kings, the suited aces. It's kind of hard to see. All the pairs, some suited connectors that are pretty low, stuff like that. That's their opening range. What's their calling range if you shove into them with 22 big blinds, if you have a really tight image? Well, I basically said ace, queen, ace, king, queens, kings, queens, jacks, and sometimes 10s. I mean, that's crazy, because what we see here is we have 26% of the hands are opening, and only 4.7% of the hands are calling you when you shove. What that means is, and by the way, it's not like when we shove 6, 7 suited into them and they call us, we're dead, we're out of the tournament. We still have 30% equity against their calling range, because even when they call us with ace, king, or ace, queen, we still have a good 42, 43% chance to win. And when they call us with aces, kings, or queens, it's a really unfortunate situation, but we still have about 20% chance to win the pot. So between the fact that even when you're called, you have 30% chance to win the whole pot, but add to that the fact that 4.7 out of 26 is more than 80% of the time. That's like an 85 or 82% of the time they're folding their hand, and you pick up it's your big blind, the blinds and the antes, it's like 10 big blinds that are in the pot, and you pick that up for free when none of them have a hand that can call you. And so you see that, even when, and obviously you can't do this very much, because the more that you do plays like this, the wider the calling range becomes for the loose aggressive player. The first time that loose aggressive player might look down. I remember, I've had so many times where I look down and I'm raising crazy hands all over the place, and I look down, I have ace jack, or I have, ace jack suited, and I raise an early position, and it goes call, call, and then the tightest player at the table goes all in for 22 big blinds. And I just look down and I laugh and I just shake my head and I say, man, if only they knew this was the best hand that I've raised the entire hour I've been sitting here. But what do? I still just fold it. It's probably not the best hand. So it's situations like that I have such a wide range, and I'm still going to fold even the best hands in that range if it's not one of the very, very best hands. I'm going to move on. The way to play a lag style, well, play a lot of pots. It's pretty fun, I have to say. You get to raise all the time. You raise a lot of pots pre-flop, especially once the antes kick in, because the antes really do add up. If you're playing a tournament with no antes, like a pot limit tournament, it's just not worth it to play a lag style at all, because the antes are like 1.5 big blinds. And so it's basically, or like 1 big blind, basically. So you're basically getting twice as much for every steal when there's antes in the pot. Okay. I don't continuation bet very often unless you have some equity in the hand. So if it's king queen on jack 9-2, I'm going to bet because oftentimes I'll take it down, but oftentimes I'm going to hit a card that's really good for me. Or king jack on 8-5-2 rainbow is a good example. Oftentimes everybody else missed, so I'm going to bet it and hope that everybody else missed. But even if they call me, if I hit a king or a jack, it's likely to be the best hand. Once again, going back, unless I'm getting trapped by that really crafty tag that attended the seminar with the queens. Most of the time, if I hit a king or a jack, it's going to be the best hand. So those are spots, but if it's four ways, I'll probably just give up more often than not. I'll go back to this example, but basically, the way that you can really make a profitable image for yourself, and if you're going to play aggressive, you're going to play lots of hands, always take the most aggressive action in a hand. And to put people on tilt, basically. If it's close raise, what does that mean? Well, I have king queen, and the board, I have raised pre-flop, and the blind calls me, and the flop comes queen 7-2, and they bet into me. Now, a lot of players just call there. They say they don't want to lose their action. They don't want to. The other player could have ace queen or pocket sevens, pocket twos, something like that. They could be bluffing, and they don't want to stop them from bluffing. I may raise in that situation. The reason I'm going to raise there is, first of all, I'm likely to raise a lot of my trash hands on that board. So when they have a queen, my kicker rates to be the best, and I'm just going to try to build up a big pot and get paid off. The key to playing lots of hands is really getting paid off when you have the best hand. So not just being content to sit around and basically just like take passive lines. So if you're playing lots of hands, really take note of that. And it doesn't mean you have to be a really lag player. You could be, just take note of how your hour's been going. Maybe you're a tight player, but you've been getting a lot of hands this hour. So people think that you're loose, Well, realize that. And then all of a sudden, maybe I've been playing tons of hands and I have queen jack of hearts, okay? And this is the example I was going to give in here. And I raise pre-flop and someone calls me. And the board is 7-5-2 with two hearts. I bet and I get called. The turn's a 2. 7-5-2-2 with two hearts still. I bet and they call me, okay? And the river's a queen. That's a great card because the hands that my opponent's likely to have are, well, some worse draws that missed anyway, but also a lot of like 6s, 8s, 9s, 10s, stuff like that. Now my queen is almost certainly the best hand. It's really hard for them to have a queen in their hand unless they were calling me twice with ace queen or king queen. That doesn't really make any sense. So most of the time I'm going to have the best hand. I see a lot of situations where really loose players will have queen jack in the spot, and then all of a sudden someone bets into you, for like 20% of the pot, and now they just call. This is a great situation to raise because you have a hand that they don't expect you to see. They don't expect to see. They don't expect you to have a queen, and they expect you to, if you're bluffing, you're going to raise. So if you're someone that bluffs a lot, don't be afraid to raise thinly for value. Is it possible that they have a boat and you're going to be raising yourself and losing chips? Of course. But the best lag players are the ones that are constantly raising, and sometimes they get called by better, but most of the time they're getting called by worse. And a lot of people will just call in that spot and say, well, I didn't think they had anything. I didn't think they had a hand to call. Well, guess what? People call. They like to call. They like to see your hand, especially if you're an aggressive player. So never think, she can't call with anything, because they can. They'll find a way. They do. I've been called by ace high in that spot. So just raise. Okay, and the last things that I want to talk about are how to, just in terms of how to preserve your own image and make sure that people don't pick up on what you're doing. There's a few ways to do this and how to craft your own image. One is never show your cards. I don't care if you're proud of quads. It doesn't matter. Just don't show your cards, That's my 99% rule. The only exception is if you're doing something that's really out of character. So I have two examples for you. One is for lags. You don't really want to tend to show your cards when you're bluffing because you're going to do a lot of it, unless it's like a super crazy bluff that you think it's going to help you in the future. So what happened to me, I was playing the Partouche Poker Tour, which I won in November, and it was down to 5 tables, and I had ace-3 suited, and a guy raised under the gun, and the button 3-bet, the button re-raised, and the button was very, liked to re-raise a lot. So I was like, whatever. I don't really think he has to have a good hand. It was a very aggressive table, very aggressive dynamic. I have ace-3 suited in the big blind. I decide to re-raise. It's a 4-bet. It's a good hand to do it with. You have an ace blocker, which means that they're less likely to have a hand like aces or ace-king, just in terms of the combinations. It's more likely that they're doing something, silly. So I raise. All of a sudden, the under-the-gun player now re-raises me, 5 bets. Now, normally I have ace-3, I'm done with the hand, right? But the button, who's a very aggressive player, just sits there and agonizes. We all have, by the way, 900,000 chips, which was 510 were the blinds, so it's 90 big blinds deep in a tournament. It's a big stack. We're all very big stacks. And it's a very big tournament. We're playing for almost $2 million. And he agonizes, and he goes into the tank, and he's just like sitting there. And I know immediately, once he's agonizing that hard, what he has. He has ace-king. The reason is, queens, I think, is an easy fold in that spot. You're deep in a tournament. You've been raised, re-raised, re-re-raised, and re-re-re-raised. Queens is easy. The reason ace-king is more difficult is because he's got blockers, and he's thinking, well, I've got these two kids here just slinging chips around. I've got an ace and a king in my hand. Do they really have an ace? You know, do they really have aces or kings, which is what they're representing? So I think when you have ace-king there, you're thinking, well, they're probably just messing around too. And, you know, at the end of the day, though, he folds because if one of us isn't messing around and has aces, his equity is so bad that he's just going to be out of the tournament. So he eventually folds his hand, but me realizing that he had to have ace-king, and I have an ace in my hand, and this kid that 5-bet me is only representing aces, so I'm like, 2 aces are gone. You know, if he has the other 2 aces, so be it, but I went all in. He folded pretty instantly at that point, and I showed my hand. And the reason I did this was because it's a pretty crazy play. I cold 4-bet, and then I 6-bet shoved with ace-3, which I don't advise you trying at home. But, you know, deep in a really big tournament. But what it did for me was, first of all, it scared them. And also, it had effects that I didn't even think were possible. Basically, this kid, the one that 5-bet me and then folded, sat on my left all of, like, day 6, I think, and he only 3-bet me once the entire time. He was so scared of me. And I saw the live stream. I saw the feed on the web after that, and the only time he 3-bet me had aces. So, you know, it was pretty interesting. You can just sort of, I knew I was never going to make that crazy a play, but I wanted them to fear me, and I wanted them to know that they were playing for all of their chips when they played a hand. So that's, you know, something that is so crazy that even I'm not going to do it again. I want, you know, in that tournament anyway, so I want them to know that I'm capable of it. So if you do something like, you know, you like, whatever, if you 5-bet shove all in with some crazy hand, just show it. That's fine. Tags, something like we talked about, you know, that 6-7 suited play, that's something that's really, really profitable to do. You can't do it very often, but it's insanely profitable. I can't even tell you. If you see the right spot, and the right spot just means a bunch of dead money in the middle with an aggressive player as the initial opener. It's such a good spot. So our plan from going forward from this point, after you leave this room, is we're going to take that spot when we see it. Okay? But in order to take that spot, we need to make sure that that original opener is not calling you with the ace-10 or the king-queen or anything like that. And how do we make sure that happens? Well, one way to do it is show it. If you re-raise, you know, aces or kings, whatever, just, you know, turn it over, whatever. Especially if you're like an older, you know, person, you're not like a young kid, you know, you have, you know, people are already going to be giving you more respect. Just show it. You know, you see players like that, and when they do that the first couple times, then, you know, people are much more wary when you're re-raising. Other things without even poker involved. Lags, more aggressive actions. Tell people you think they're bluffing more. There are times when someone will say something like, someone will make a bet, and I'll know it's not a bluff. And I'll say something like, show the bluff, you know. Something like that, just to make people think that I'm constantly thinking about bluffing, you know. It's not necessarily true, but it gets people thinking that I'm always bluffing when I'm making big bets. For tags, quieter, less conspicuous presence. Don't try to steal the smallest pots, another thing, you know. Like, when it comes, you know, when there's like 3 big blinds out there, it's a limp and checked around, and check, 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 and it looks like no one really wants it. Sometimes it's good to try to steal those pots, but if my plan is to steal the bigger pots, I don't really want to be as involved in the smaller pots. There's not as much there to win, and what you do there is you basically make yourself a more aggressive player. You give yourself a more aggressive image. So if I have a really tight image, and I know, like, let's say I get 2 really good spots today that I'm going to steal because they're going to think I have aces. Do I want my spot to be when there's 3 big blinds in the middle, or do I want my spot to be when there's 11 big blinds in the middle? You know, really think about the fact that you have to preserve your own image to find the most profitable spots, rather than just saying, okay, no one wants this pot, I'm going to try to take it down, which, you know, seems like an easier way to go about it. But really think about what's going to be the most profitable thing for you to do that day, and how can I make sure that it works out when I get that situation. Now, sometimes you won't even get the situation, and then you'll be like, well, I wish I'd stolen that 3 big blind pot, but that's just the nature of the game. And then the last thing that I'll say is, basically, it's just a continuation of the same thing. How do you preserve the image? well, the opposite to showing when you do something really out of character, this comes up a lot more. When you do something out of character that you're going to be doing more often, it goes against your image, try not to show it. So an example for a tag, let's say under the gun opened, someone else called, or not under the gun, middle position open, someone else called. I'm on the button with Jack 8 suited. Great situation for a squeeze play when you're a tight player, because they're likely to have bad hands and you're going to get respect. You squeeze, and instead of folding, they decide to call you. The flop comes 8-4-2. Maybe I make a small bet, just see if I have the best hand, take it down, whatever. They call me, right? The turn's a queen, okay? Sometimes some people are going to check this down because, you know, hopefully their 8's the best hand if the other guy has 6s, 5s, 7s, something like that. But if not, then they don't want to lose any more chips, something like that. Well, for all the reasons we talked about two-barreling, first of all, two-barreling is great here. You're going to get them off of 9s, 10s, jacks, all those hands. But in addition, another consideration that you really want to think about is, well, I don't really want to turn over my hand. It's Jack 8 suited. So, you know, it's going to be really out of character. Now they know what I'm up to. So I'm not saying you have to make a huge bet that's going to be really unprofitable, but when it's a close decision between betting again and checking, which I think this is, checking is good because you could get to showdown and they could have 5s, 7s, or 6s, something like that. But betting again is good because you could get them off of bigger hands too. So we have two close decisions. I'm more likely to take the decision that's going to preserve my image. Now I know I don't want to show down Jack 8 suited in that spot, so I might bet again. Doesn't have to be a big bet, you know, 2/5 of the pot, something like that. And that's going to help preserve my image. The other example is if I'm a lag and I flat, let's say I flat call with ace-king out of the big blind, because it's partly trapping, but partly because as a lag, I don't always re-raise my ace-kings, because the converse of what I said about when you're a tag and you have ace-king, you keep on barreling because they're likely to give you respect. With me, like, they always just want to put me on nothing. So with ace-king, it's not even the best hand because, like, if I miss, like, they're going to call me anyway because they're like, put me on ace-king, even though, you know, I don't usually have ace-king. I have like 10-6 suited or whatever. So, but they're going to put me on ace-king. So I don't always re-raise it. I usually do, but sometimes I just flat call it. But once again, you know, the flop is Jack 6-2 rainbow, and I check, and maybe they check behind, and the turn's like an 8. Okay? Well, is ace-king the best hand? I don't know, honestly. I'm sorry, it goes check, check, and the river's a 2. So we have Jack 6-2, 8-2. Once again, I don't know if ace-king's the best hand, but I'm out of character here, and I've done something that I really don't want them to see, and if I check and they check behind, I'm likely to have the best hand, but I really don't want to show this down. So what do? Well, I make a really tiny bet. Sometimes it even gets called by a worse hand, and then I win more, you know, more chips. But oftentimes they just fold. But I think it's worth it. You know, the pot's 11 big blinds. I bet maybe 3 big blinds. It's worth a little bit of risk that maybe they call me with a better hand. But what I preserve is the idea that I can flat call ace-king. Because the next time, the idea of flat calling ace-king, by the way, is when it comes ace-6-2, and they have a hand like ace-jack, no one's ever folding ace-jack to me on an ace-6-2 board because they don't put me on ace-king if I didn't re-raise pre-flop. I want to make sure they don't think that I can have that hand. So when this spot comes up, rather than showing it down, I'm going to make a little bet and make sure that they're not able to see my cards. And so those are just, I guess, like I know this was a lot of material, but basically those are some examples of ways that you can use your image, preserve your image, and win some tournaments, hopefully. So.